behavior. And in fact, this is one of the things that we've learned in some number of years of doing social network studies with adolescent peer groups in schools, for example, that one of the riskiest aspects of a child's social environment, as far as substance abuse is concerned, is whether they have friends who are already drinking or using drugs or something like that. And this is by now quite well known. But you run into questions there of whether for example, kids choose each other as friends because they have similar behaviors, or whether they choose their friends for other reasons, and then their friends influence them to start using the behaviors. And so that's called the birds of a feather flock together hypothesis, which would be that, you know, you choose as friends people who are like you, versus the idea that these friends actually influence you, and that's how you become similar. One of the things we found out with adolescent substance use is that both of those things are true. So kids will choose each other if their behaviors are similar, but they also influence each other to continue or possibly adopt those behaviors. So these are the questions you can investigate using this, this kind of methodology. Essentially, it's a way of looking at how individuals form social structures. That's what the social network represents. And then how those structures reflect back on the individual behavior. It's a really fundamental aspect of social dynamics, which has been long recognized in the world of both sociology and psychology. In fact, I even heard a interesting talk the other day by an economist who's recently written a book on this. You know, economists are famous for developing models where individuals are independent agents making decisions. And they've been very slow to recognize the fact that that's just not true, and that social context really is important. But basic economic models have yet to really reflect that kind of interdependence between the social environment and behavior. So anyway, it's a really useful framework for thinking about how, you know, behavioral evolution occurs, and how and why people affiliate with each other, and how these things relate to each other. Okay, so that's a very quick overview of the problem. Questions so far? Okay, feel free to jump in here if you need to. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to set up one of these models, and how to run it. All right. So, looking at our script here, can everybody see my cursor moving? Hopefully so. Let me know if you can't. I see a few nods, so that's good. All right.
John, a quick question before
Sure.
you start. Can you talk at all about setting up the function so that you can get R-Siena into your program?
Yeah. Okay, so here we are in the RStudio environment. Just quickly, these windows are code windows over here. Here's an outline of what's in the code window. This environment tab here will include all of the objects in a workspace that I'm about to import. And then down here, various other things are displayed, such as, like, for example, I can look at all of the files that are in the repository that I use here. I use Git, by the way. We use Git as a way of storing our repository online and sharing the data. It's a private repo because the data is private. But I'm sure that if you want to get a hold of any of this code, that, you know, you just have to work with Lenny.
Is that the same as GitHub?
Correct. So
Okay.
GitHub is the basically the file server location that runs, you know, Git. But you can run Git on, private Git repositories if you want. Git is the name of the software, though, that does the, it's basically a versioning software.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Anyway, one of the tabs over here is packages. Well, famously, R has a zillion and one packages that you can use that do many, many nice statistical kinds of modeling. Again, I'm kind of going to assume that you're familiar generally with the fact that, you know, R has a lot of packages and you at least know something about packages. But the one that you will have to download for to use this code that I'm about to show you, there are several actually, but they're shown right here, okay? When and if you get a hold of the script, you can just use these particular ones here. A couple of things about this. I use the dplyr world, which is a code base within R developed by, now we're going to blank on his name. Geez, old age is a wonderful thing.
Hadley Wickham.
Hadley Wickham, geez, yep. Of course, you know. Anyway, you'll see that there's some very nice coding things about that. If you're unfamiliar with Hadley's sort of tidyverse world, which is all of his packages together are kind of called, I think you'll see some of the advantages associated with that. For us, we need to use the main package that we're going to use here is R-Siena, and I'm actually using a version here called R-Siena Test, which is, it's like using a pre-release latest and greatest stuff version, but it's a very stable release. And so generally speaking, I just load R-Siena Test. It has some features that R-Siena, plain R-Siena doesn't have, but you can download this from CRAN, which is the central repository of our packages. I don't know if R-Siena Test is on CRAN, but you can download a binary version from Tom Snyder's website. Tom is the guy that wrote this package, and you can get to that website by Googling Siena, S-I-E-N-A, networks. And it's a website hosted by Oxford University. Okay. There's also, for those of you on the project team, note that we use RHNet tools here, which is a package that I wrote mostly, that contains a bunch of useful functions for assembling and processing network data. JML utils is another one that has a few functions in there that are useful, but they're not network specific. And then the rest of them are all by and large available on CRAN. Questions on that so far? Okay. So
if we wanted to try and install for our own purposes RHNet tools and JML utils, is there a link to go to since those aren't available on CRAN? Are they?
I think that those are private right now, but there's really no particular reason they have to be. I mean, it's just code. So let me know if you want to look at any look at any of that stuff, and I'll make it available to you.
Okay, yeah, because I was successful yesterday in getting R-Siena Test to load on my.
Well done.
So
did you have to compile it, by the way?
I did.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, that's another little extra step, by the way, because it means you have to have some other tools, and like dev tools, for example.
Yeah.
Installed. Yeah. You need to have a C++ compiler installed.
Yeah.
And a few things like that. And there are tutorials available as to how to do that. If you're a pretty good R mechanic, you can figure it out easily. If not so much, let me know. I can help you.
As far as I know, it loaded error-free. I haven't played around with any of the functions yet. So
rock and roll. Okay,
yeah,
good.
We'll see.
All right. So
John, just two things. One is just to let everybody know I'm actually recording this, and I hope everybody's okay with that. If they're not, let me know. So we'll have this available for anyone to look after the meeting. And Myra, can I ask you, on our W drive, do we have R-Siena tests? Do we have some of these packages that we could make available to people?
So I have a zip file that John has shared with me over email that I can send over to everyone so that they are able to install it onto their studio.
But these things are all available out there on the web, and all you really need is a link. Okay, so I just loaded these packages, and you might notice I use a few techniques here for doing that, you know, this code here only installs packages that aren't installed already. And then I use a nice little package called here that sets a working directory, which basically turns out to be the home directory of the repo. It's right here. If I go up one thing here, I'm now in a folder I created on my computer called Git repos. And this is where I keep all my Git repositories, my local versions of the Git repositories. Okay, great. So okay, here we are. So now I'm back in the repo again. Okay. And coming down here, I'm going to load the environment, the workspace. This will, of course, be a little specific to whatever you do, but this code here should pick up your working directory the same way as it does for me, wherever your local repository is, assuming you're using Git. Okay, and so here's all the objects now that I have here. It looks like there's a lot of them, but a lot of them are serving the same purpose. They're just like different waves of the same data, and most of it you won't need to worry about too much, but I will show you some of these objects that you can just use without having to recreate them. It'll make life a lot easier for you. Okay? All right. By the way, for project team, on all of these scripts, I have annotated most of the code. That is to say, I've tried to give descriptions of not only what it's doing, but why it's doing it to the best of my knowledge. So you don't you don't necessarily have to take notes here. I think these notes may suffice. And then you can ask me questions later. All right. First thing, we're going to create what I call a network set for analysis. Now, a network set is a term that I kind of invented, which basically means a set of networks which are internally consistent in the sense that they refer to the same set of participants over some longitudinal set of waves. And remember that R-Siena, the stochastic actor models that it estimates, is fundamentally a longitudinal model. You know, it is trying to predict changes in networks and changes in behavior that may be associated with the change in the networks. So it's not meaningful to use non-longitudinal data with it. I mean, you actually kind of can phony baloney it up to do cross-sectional analysis. But if you want to do cross-sectional analysis, predictive cross-sectional analysis of networks, there are other modeling packages that are approaches that are more suitable for that.
And John, can you just tell us just a little bit about kind of R-Siena, where it came from, and you know, why you think it's the thing that people should probably be investing time in learning, given what it can do?
Actually, Lenny, I think that's a top. I'll say a few things about that, but you know, we could do 2 hours just on that. No problem at all. What I would recommend is that you go to this program was developed by a guy named Tom Snijders, who's from the Netherlands. Snijers is the way he pronounces, or where he spells his last name. And Tom is a sociologist / statistician at the University of Groningen, and he's now retired, but he's still actively working on the program R-Siena, which does something that he calls stochastic actor-oriented modeling, or SAOM. And it implements the kind of model that I described earlier, i.e. one where you're looking at to predict changes in networks over time and associated changes in behaviors as a result of the affiliations that are created in those networks. That's the basic idea, is to model that interdependence. There's no other approach to this that I'm aware of that does exactly the same thing, although there are other kinds of network-related models, which I'm not going to go into here. And they include stuff like ergoms exponentially. God, what does ergom stand for? Anyway, they're basically a type of model which allows you to predict types of structures that seem likely to develop in a network based on, based on the frequency of those structures within the network. This type of model is more oriented towards, as you will see, a kind of a decision-making approach to describing networks. That is to say, people prefer structures of this or that or the other type, depending on the characteristics of the people they might choose, depending on their own characteristics, and depending on the network structure at any given time. Well, that's perfectly suited for the kind of thing that we want to do, because we assume that people in recovery homes develop relationships and that they then make choices on the basis of those relationships. So it's a paradigm that really works well for social networks where individuals have agency in terms of creating the relationships that they have, and where they have agency in terms of, you know, adopting or stopping certain behaviors, certain other behaviors of their own. So that's just a very, very quick introduction to this. But I can say that before Tom developed this, there was really no particularly compelling way to model networks longitudinally. And this methodology has become quite popular in the social sciences now. It's quite well respected. It's got its limitations, as you'll see, but that's the basic idea. Okay, does that help? Okay, hope so.
Thanks, John.
Sure. All right. So I was going back to the idea of a network set. A network set is a self-consistent set of networks. Networks can be represented in a computer as either a matrix or, well, it's a matrix or some way of presenting a matrix. And the idea is that a row represents somebody who chooses somebody else for a particular relationship, let's say as a friend, and the column is the person who gets chosen. So, and directed networks are therefore asymmetrical networks, because the upper triangular part of it is people making choices, the lower triangular part, I mean, and the upper triangular part is being chosen. And those two don't have to be the same. If they're the same, then the network is called non-directed. So you just have like a line between two relationships without an arrow on either end. But if you think about choosing as creating an arrow from me to you, then the representation is asymmetrical. The matrix that represents it is asymmetrical, and the network is called directed. And we work with directed networks here. The idea being that there can be an initiation of a relationship by one person, which is then responded to by the other person. That's kind of a rough way to kind of think about it. Okay. But creating a network set is kind of a pain in the neck, because you have to make sure that, you know, it's got a consistent set of individuals in it, and you run into issues of missing data. And, you know, sometimes people come and go from the network, and what do you do with all of that? Well, what I did was I just created a function that kind of basically takes care of all of this. And I'm going to slide down here and show you, just go over all of this stuff here. when you get to the point where you have to create this object here, which I call longtb.net.w1 to 6.2. Well, that's just, what that is an edge list format network, which basically means you have a row for every individual who chooses somebody else. In a sparse network, that would mean that networks that that individuals, well, that there's no row for any case in which one individual does not choose somebody else. So if you have 3 people, and the only relationship there is that person 1 chooses person 2, you only need 1 row to represent that network. On the other hand, our networks are all complete within houses because everybody rated everybody else on the basis of several types of relationships, including friendship, among others. In spite of that, it's a very handy way to represent a network as an edge list, because you can easily go through such a representation and see who chose whom, who was chosen by whom. You often will, like, for example, this particular table here, longtb.net, I'm just going to open that up and show you what it looks like. By the way, for you people on the project team, you can just use this table here. You don't really need to worry about where it came from. Every network that we could possibly want to create can be created from this object. So you don't have to worry about where this came from, just use it, okay? So that'll simplify things for us. But just to give you an idea what it looks like here, that's kind of small. Can you guys see that okay? Let me see if we can make it any bigger. I made it a little bigger. That's better. Okay. What you see here is that the rows in this matrix here, okay, here's a subject ID. This HID is a house ID, so that's a recovery home they live in. This is the wave ID, okay? So we have 6 waves of data, so these waves will go from 1 to 6. And you'll notice that we also have what I call an alt ID. Now this is somebody to whom that SID 1000 rated, presumably a member of this person's house. So these guys are all in house 10, right, in wave 1. And this is a relationship, this row here shows how SID 1000 rated individual 1001 as a friend, as a potential person they would loan money to, somebody that they would help with tasks around the house, somebody they have conversations with, somebody they would go to for advice, and forget what that one is. Oh, that's their rating as to how close the relationship is, okay? All right, and so basically this information can be used to create a network of friendship, loaning, helping, conversation, advice, or closeness. And you can set a threshold in, I made everything bigger, didn't I? That's all right. Actually, that's a little easier to see that way, isn't it? The make network set allows you to do things like decide what kind of relationship you want. So that's the p-type net parameter, which can be FR, LO, AD, a bunch of other things. If you just go to the help text for make network set, it tells you all those possibilities. It tells you, you get to choose what type of output it creates. You can create a regular matrix output. You can create a sparse matrix output, which is what actually R-Siena needs as its input. And you can set a threshold for what is considered to be a friend. If the threshold is this high or higher, the number is positive. If it's this high, if it's this value or lower, then it's negative. There's kind of a way of setting thresholds either on this end of the continuum or that end of the continuum. Let's see.
So John, just real quickly, just by changing that one line, you know, basically friendships are rated across 5 domains. And we're basically saying, if you're a friend or a good friend, we're going to count it. And if you're something else like an acquaintance, we're not going to say it's a friendship. So by that one line, just by changing that one number, we could change basically looking at just friend or good friend to everyone's selection of just a good friend. So in other words, so we could change the criteria just by that one line.
And the way, that's the idea, is that, you know, this this function kind of encapsulates pretty much everything that you'd want to change about a network. You know, at least it's relevant to what the kinds of things that we want to do. There's certain things that it won't do, but we don't have to really go into that right now. For example, here, right now, the number 2 means that the rating is a 1 or a 2, right? Because the minus means that it's this high or lower. Okay, so a 2 or a 1 is what's indicated by the negative 2. If it was a +2, it would be 2, 3, 4, or 5. Okay, and that turns out to mean that the person rated this other guy as a friend or good friend, and that if a person was rated as a friend or good friend, your network should code that relationship as a 1. If not, it would code it as a 0. So let's suppose you wanted to change that threshold to being just a good friend, but not necessarily a mere friend. In that case, you would just change this value here to 1. Okay, and so now it will only take good friends and code them as a 1, and any other relationship, friendship-related relationship, will be a 0. Okay? We'll leave that the way it is for right now.
And John, can you just sort of tell us what would be the difference between finding out whether everyone is a good friend versus everyone is just a friend or a good friend? Why might that make a difference?
Well, there may be, it may, in the first place, it might be that the criteria for forming a good friendship are different. Maybe, for example, it's less likely that a good friendship is mutually agreed upon, okay? You know, it's a possibility, in other words, that if I say that sometimes people don't agree on whether they are in a good friendship. And that might particularly be true when there are status differences. So, you know, maybe I think I'm good friends with my boss, but my boss has a lot of underlings, you know, and doesn't necessarily consider them all to be good friends, you know. So that's, in fact, that's something that, you know, when I was in grad school, we used to call the Ringo Starr fan club phenomenon, right? It's like everybody knows Ringo Starr and his fan club, but he doesn't know everybody because there's too many of them, you know. Okay, so that it would be that kind of a thing. It may also be that certain kinds of social influence only occur through really close linkages. You know, maybe you can pick up some behaviors from casual friends. You know, maybe, you know, their taste in music, I don't know, stuff like that. But when it comes down to, you know, other kinds of issues, such as, well, I don't know, possibly helping somebody with their recovery from substance abuse. Maybe that's not something that you really are going to get from somebody who's just a casual acquaintance. Maybe you need to have a close relationship with somebody else for them to be able to help you.
So John, it it's interesting. You call it a good friend. Myra, did we not code that a close friend rather than a good friend?
Yeah, it's called close friend in the instrument.
So, my bad.
So it's okay. But I think a close friend versus a friend, I could see the distinction between those two. And by the way, this is dichotomizing it. What if we wanted the whole full scale? The question is, in a sense, how friendly are you with this person? And we have 5 choice points going from good friend to basically adversary. What if we took the 5 points? Can you do that, or does it have to be chunked into dichotomous?
It has to be dichotomous for this particular program. It is possible to do analyses that are kind of ordinal in nature. Basically, the idea is that you know, you can use the same network where one network is kind of a subset of the other one. That is to say, you've got a network of, let's say, friends and good friends, and a subset of that is a network of just the good friends, right? Because you're, you know, obviously, if you're a good friend, then you're a friend too, but the reverse is not true. So the one network is basically contained within the other, and you can kind of do what amounts to like a valued network study showing transitions between levels by treating those as separate networks, one of which is encapsulated within the other, and looking at whether one can transition from the not so close friendship network into the close friend network, and what predicts that. So there's a way to do it. It's a little funky and it's not completely straightforward, but we've actually used that. Lenny, you might remember from some of our studies with your preliminary study data from 5 or 6 years ago. And you get some interesting results that way. But again, I'm not going to really go into that today. It's kind of an advanced topic. All right, so what I've got here is, given that this table here represents all of the network relationships that are going to be of interest, not only to the analyses I'm doing right now, but you know, you guys can really think of this as being the table you should pretty much always use to start creating networks, and just go right straight down here to the mate network set code. When I do that, what I end up with is, like this object here, fnet, is a list. I'll show you that. Consisting of matrices, okay? And you can see it's a 627 by 627 matrix. Look at that. Every single wave has the same size matrix. Therefore, it must be the case they all refer to the same individuals. Wait a second, you say. What's up with that? Because we know that not everybody in this study arrived at wave 1. Some people arrived later. Some people left earlier. So what's up with this, you know, dimension of the matrix being the same for every wave? Well, the answer to that is that R-Siena requires you to include in every wave every participant. They each have to have a row and a column in every wave. But there's a way that you can tell R-Siena, okay, this guy wasn't here for this wave or for this set of waves. And that's called composition change. And as we'll see, we're able to create a composition change object, which will then inform R-Siena which of these rows and columns to use on any given pair of waves, essentially. But this is the way we have to set it up initially. And you can see how this would be very messy to try to do all of this just with, you know, raw code every time through. And it's a lot of the reason why, and oh, by the way, one of the other cool things here, not so cool, is that R-Siena does not use identifying values, subject IDs, for rows and columns in the network. And you can only imagine what a mess that would create if you had to create raw matrices and then stitch them all together, right? Because basically what it's using is it's using the order of the rows and columns to figure out who's who in this whole analysis, and to figure out who should be, like, you know, what characteristic of the individual data should be associated with what row and what column. It's all done by the order of the object that's created. And so you can see, if you were trying to do this all just, you know, from, you know, with raw code every time, you could get so messed up, it'd be ridiculous. You know, you'd have the wrong guy associated with the wrong data, and oh God, it would be awful. So this, I'm sorry. There are several important things about this object, aside from setting up the networks here, that are important. And one of them is this table here. And it turns out that that table basically is an object which has one row for every one of the 627 subjects potentially in the analysis, along with the subject ID. So that's what's missing out of these matrices. But you can infer what row and column is associated with what ID by just looking at this 627 length vector, right? Because the vector will describe, okay, the first row or first column is going to be guy 1000. The first row or first column, a second one will be person 1001, and so forth and so on. Okay, so if you ever need to know what actual subject IDs are associated with a particular row or column in these matrices up here, this tells you, all right? And that's very useful for later programming, again, most of which I've encapsulated for you, but, you know, if you wanted to do it yourself, you could work with this object. Then we have a set of columns in this table here, which describe the house that the person was in at wave 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And that's also a very useful thing to know. And let's see here. And we actually have a raw version of this table that I show you right here, where guy 1000 was in house number 10 at wave 1, and then he's not in the study for the rest of the time. Guy 1001 was in house number 10 at wave 1, house number 10 at wave 2, and then he's gone, okay? And so on. And, you know, here's somebody who, as we go down further here, person 1091 wasn't in the study at all at wave 1 or wave 2, or at wave 1, but then he shows up in house 12 at wave 2, etc. Okay, so this basically, this table here, which goes along with the object, which is that's created by Make Network Set, is really, really useful for figuring out who's around when, and can also be used then for just making subsequent decisions about who to include in an analysis.
So,
okay?
So John, can I just real quickly add, for those who are a little bit fresher to this, we had Oxford houses, which are recovery homes in 3 states, North Carolina, Texas, Oregon, equally divided in those 3 states. And we basically sampled them every 4 months. But some people, as John said, came in and stayed for the 2 years, but some people came in different parts. So it's a naturalistic observational study, and we're just kind of looking at them over time. We're not trying to intervene. And one thing I noticed was 627. That's an interesting number. And I know we've had some controversy about trying to figure out how we count numbers. Mike, does that sound comfortable to you, that 627?
Yeah, because I think there's some people who never got rated.
Yeah.
So there were 632 people that show up in the survey data, but not all of those people had got, for some reason, nobody ever rated them, and so they kind of fell out of the rating. The network.
They were probably people who surveyed, but who left the house. You know, either they didn't get included in the house roster in time to be rated during the time that they did their survey. I mean, ideally, that should never have happened, but in a few cases it did happen, evidently. By the way, we just terminologically, we use the term network data to refer to the ratings of these relationships. And individual characteristic data, we just call survey data, because that's sort of the typical way we think of survey data, you know, one row per subject, a bunch of characteristics for that subject. But in this case, of course, we can have such a row for every wave the guy surveyed. Now, let me just point out, like I was mentioning here, you know, we see 1077 and 1078 were only around at wave 1 in house 21. But here's, you know, person 1079 who was around for all 6 waves and was in the same house, house 22. So you can see the kind of information that this includes. It's just, it's like an inclusion matrix for, it's not a matrix really, the inclusion record for every individual in the subject for every wave. And the way you see inclusion is whether they have a house ID for that wave or not. If it's missing, they weren't there. We don't have any data on them for that wave. If it's a number, then that tells you what house they were in that wave. Okay?
And John, are you including, does R-Siena care if these people move from one house to another?
Yeah. So, you know, if we look through here enough, we would probably see a few cases where, I'm just trying to eyeball. Most people did not move houses, but a few did. Okay, here's somebody who was in house 14 at wave 2, but now they show up in house 23 at wave 5. Okay. All right, so enough of that. Mainly this, this object, this FNet object, is constructed in a way that makes it easy, as we will see, to import it to R-Siena, because R-Siena requires you to create R-Siena specific data objects out of regularly formatted R objects. And so what I've tried to do is sort of set the table for that conversion process in the most straightforward possible way. And that's what this code is supposed to do. Okay. So to repeat, oops, I'm in the wrong place here. So here in the setup script, this code from where we load the workspace until we start using the make network set code here is there for documentation reasons. If you want to look at it and see how I made the, selected the subjects that I selected, feel free to look at it, but we don't really have to worry about those details right now. It's got to do with characteristics of the network data and characteristics of the file that Myra, Megan, and Mike put together, which is kind of our definitive list of who was actually in the study at every given wave. That turned out to be kind of complicated, but we don't have to go into all those machinations here, okay? So basically you start here when you start creating a stochastic actor model, okay? All right, so what I've done here is to create a object called FNet. Another one here that I haven't actually created yet is BFNet for best friend net. And this would have, as we noted above, only the best friends or the close friends. Suppose I should call it CFNet if I really want to be completely consistent with our terminology. So in fact, I'm going to change that right here. CFNet for close friend only, okay? And then we already have something called the loan network. Here the threshold was set at, you know, you're willing to loan the person $100 or $500. So at least $100. was the criteria used there. And the advice network is just somebody you go to very often, or at least quite often. And the threshold there was 2. So a 1 or 2 rating gets a 1 in that network. All right. So these things have all been created. They can be used. They're right over here in the repository, and you can use them without having to recreate them. But if you want to set a different threshold, you would have to create a different network and give it a different name. These things, LoneNet, EdVNet, FNet, CFNet, etc., will all be, as we will see, processed with very little wraparound code into an R-Siena network object later on. Okay.
So John, what's cool about this is we can really look at those different gradations of how close your friendship is and see, does that make a difference? If you're just a friend or a close friend, does that make a difference in terms of the whole structure? So it sounds like within just one quick change, we could have a whole different set of analyses. Who knows?
Yep. Yeah, it's very easy to set up these networks by, with this methodology, and you have the choice of which waves to select, what type of relationship to select, what type of output you want, although usually you'll choose this. Usually these last 2 here I just said is true and false, respectively. The include alt ID means, should you include individuals in the analysis who didn't rate anybody, but they were rated by somebody else? Usually we don't want to do that, but there may be cases in the future where you want to. So essentially it's only these things from PT hold on up. These are the parameters you want to change. The rest are just.
So John, you talked about directional networks. In other words, I rate you, you rate me. It goes back and forth. Do we ever, these are dimensional, bidimensional. Do we ever just look at one dimension of, for example, does anybody rate me as being a friend? I might think everyone's a friend, but no one wants to be a friend of me. Is that sort of one way, just people directed toward me? Have we ever thought of doing that? And would that make any difference?
You can always, once you've created a network, okay, by any of these criteria, then you can ask questions like that. Are there people here who seem to, for example, consider a lot of other people in the house to be close friends, but nobody thinks they're close friends? That would be an interesting question to ask. And that's something we actually do see, by the way, in adolescent networks, where especially with younger adolescents, there's, those kids aren't so good at really, they're kind of in the process of learning how to socialize with their peers. And there's a phenomenon that's been identified in several studies where certain kids will think they have X number of other friends, but none of those friends really think this other kid is their friend. These are various terms for those, but these are kids who seem to have a problem attaching to others socially, and that has certain consequences. So yes, you can totally look at that kind of phenomenon. It's not really a function of how you define the network, it's a question of how you use the network data after you've defined it. Make sense?
Yeah, and John, the reason, just for everybody who's not as familiar with our work, about 10 years ago, Ed Stevens found that if you sort of found a friend, if there was someone that's a close friend, in other words, someone had a close friend in the Oxford house, that was clearly the best predictor of outcomes, staying there 6 months, actually great outcomes 2 years later. So
yeah, we haven't really looked yet in this data to see whether there's, whether simply having one or more close friends is enough. But that's something we totally need to do. So, well, good point, Lenny. Okay, so now that we've established these, I have a little bit of other code where I'm just checking to make sure that the networks all include the same individuals and stuff like that. I could have just removed this code. We don't have to talk about this right now. But, it gives you an idea of the kind of checking that I did to make sure everything was cool. All right. The next step we have to take care of is add something that's called structural zeros. You might remember, going back here to our old friend FNet, that we have a 627 by 627 matrix. But not all of these people can be friends with each other. Why? Because they're in different houses, right? So we need to figure out some kind of a way to constrain the network to tell the R-Siena program that these two guys can never be friends because they're in different houses. And it turns out that the way you do that is to insert a structural zero, which turns out to be the code 10, into the network. And I can show you just here that, you know, what that ends up looking like. If I've got a, here's a little snippet of the first part of the first wave of the data. And what do you see? Now let's let it finish, okay? What you see here is the network within the first house, which I think is house 10, okay? And you'll notice there are ones and zeros included here. So person 1,000 is friends with everybody but 1,006, you know, chooses them as a friend. 1,001 rates 1,000 as a friend, and only fails to rate 1,005 as a friend or close friend, right? And so on. But now look, because person 1,000 is not in the next house, which I think was house 12, okay? That person has a structural zero for all of these values because he or she did not choose and could not choose 1,007, 1,008, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, as a friend because they're not in the same house. So what we really have here is we have this big 627 by 627 social network matrix, but it's constrained. Not every relationship represented by that 627 by 627 matrix is allowed to be a real relationship. Well, that's important because the data that's being described here has to be constrained so relationships can only occur within a house. And that's important, you know, both in terms of what the data actually show that we give to the program, and also it will turn out in terms of the way that the model gets estimated. Because the model is estimated by iteratively assigning, you know, iterating coefficients on the effects that we put in it based upon the data that it actually sees. And that would mean that there was a possibility, if we didn't constrain that data, that, you know, stochastically speaking, person 1,000 could end up choosing 1,007 under certain circumstances in the course of this, the simulations that do the estimation. But we have to tell it can't do that, okay? Because that's not actually data, right? That would be speculative as to whether that could happen if these two people happen to be in the same house. But in terms of what the relationships actually are, all we can do is present the within-house relationships. And so the structural zeros ensure that the estimation program understands that this is a constrained matrix. This is data here. This is not data over here. Those relationships do not and cannot exist. Cool? Okay.
What would the NA mean then? That the person just, didn't provide data for that person?
Yes, NA is different. NA is an actual missing value. So it turns out that person 1013, for some reason, didn't rate 1011, okay? And R-Siena treats structural zeros as meaning that relationship can't exist, don't ever let it happen. It will treat this in different ways depending on some other specifications you give it, but most typically what it will do is it will simply impute that value from one wave to another if it doesn't have it. But it has other ways of dealing with this. by the way missing values are dealt with in R-Siena and the way missing data in general is treated is kind of a separate topic, and I don't think we have time to get into that today. But if you're interested in it, the R-Siena manual, which you can download from Tom Snyder's website at Oxford, goes into all that stuff. In fact, anybody who's really serious about using this code and using this modeling technique probably should at least have that manual and probably at least look over the introductory parts of it. It's not always the clearest thing in the world because, I mean, Tom's English is very good, but he's still not a native English speaker. And sometimes his descriptions can be a little bit convoluted. But it's gotten better over the years, and it's really, on the whole, quite good, in my opinion. Okay, let's move on then. All right, structural zeros. So actually, that's very easy too. All you do is you take the network that was created by make network set, and you run the S0 fill function on it. This is a function in RHNetTools. That again could be a kind of a pain in the neck, depending on how good of an R mechanic you are. But this goes ahead and fills in structural zeros for people who are not in the same house in any given wave. And that results in the network we just saw a snippet of, where you have those tens, okay? So that's all very easy, but don't forget to do it. You'll notice that the transformed FNet has been called FNet 0 to indicate that it's got structural zeros in it, okay? Then one other step, which by the way, I need to kind of, for some reason, I used to have the make network set function used to create these sparse matrices. The format is called the DGT matrix. It's the particular format of matrix that R-Siena likes as input. It turns out that you can give it either an array as input, that is to say, basically a three-dimensional meta matrix, where the third dimension is wave, or you can give it a list of DGT matrices. For some reason, I used to have this DGT matrix format as an output possibility. I took it out. So I need to put it back in, because if you want to give R-Siena a list, which I kind of like to do, it has to be in that format. But as you can see, the conversion to a DGT matrix format is very easy. And these three lines of code do that for FNet 0, EdVnet, and LoneNet. And then I just gave them the name FNet 0.sp for sparse, because this is a sparse network format.
John, can you remind those of us that don't work in the tidyverse what the percent angle percent does?
That's the pipe operator. And basically what the pipe operator does is it lets you compose functions without putting them all in parentheses. So what this means is, okay, this is going to be the output. And you start out with the list of matrices from 1 to 6 of FNet 0, because that's the format they're in. And then to that you apply this code here. So you do an lapply on whatever the X object is. In this case, it turns out to be FNet 0, 1 to 6. You apply the conversion to DGT matrix, all right? So basically, this would be like taking the DGT matrix function and wrapping it around this code here in parentheses. But instead of doing that, it says, take this, this will be your end product. Take this thing and then apply this to it here. If you didn't do that, then you would have to put these things in pairs of parentheses to apply a function of a function of a function, right? And that gets increasingly difficult to interpret as you have more and more parentheses. So it's a way to compose functions that allows you to let the composition occur in a more natural way, so that you can read the code more easily. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So with the conventional R code, you just have the FNet 0, the first six elements inside the lapply?
Correct.
Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah, mathematically, it's similar to f of g of x, or
exactly. You're
function.
composing functions, but instead of doing it, from the inside out, you're kind of doing it from the outside in.
Right.
If that makes any sense.
Yep.
Yeah, and people who aren't mathematicians are happier with that, and I just think it's better from a coding point of view too. But depends a little bit on what you're used to. Okay. Yeah, this pipeline operator is a really great thing, and I use this, throughout my code here, and I'll show you some examples of this later on that may be a little more transparent than this. Okay, so anyway, for right now, we have to convert that list of matrices into a list of DGT matrices. This is just a type conversion. But I'm going to, as soon as I can find the time, I'm going to change the RHNet's make network set function so that that'll be an option. And you won't have to do this stuff at all. You can just export it as a set of DGT matrices. Okay? All right. Okay. So here I'm just sort of summarizing what I've made. I've got 3 types of sparse matrices representing 6 waves of network data. And then I've got a something called survey.w1 to 6, which includes the individual characteristic data by wave. And if you want to see that, you can always just go over here and look at it. Here's survey W1 to 6. And as promised, it's just a set of, it's just survey data by wave. So here's, Guy 1000's wave 1 data. What house is he in? What region is the house in? His or her sex, race, age, number of months they've been in residence, blah, 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 blah. Okay. All right. Now, I'm now going to make a sub-selection of the survey wave 1 to 6 data, because these are the variables I'm most likely to use in an R-Siena analysis upcoming. You might want to include other variables from this object here for your analyses. But I'm just staging those in a subset of survey.w1 to 6. Going to have the same format as survey.w1 to 6, but it only includes these variables here. And those are subject ID, wave ID, sex, race, age, region, what I call INRESMO1, which is the number of months the person was in residence at their first wave where they were surveyed, okay? A log transformation of that same variable right here. That's where the ln comes in. Exit type, which we're all familiar with, those of us who work with this data, why they left the house, if they left it, okay? And, well, the type of exit, basically, was it a positive or negative exit? And then the more specific reason they left. So these should all be familiar to people on our project here. For the rest of you, they may sound a little bit mysterious, but basically they're just individualized variables that apply to participants. Okay. Now, I use, well, this code here is not really important either, except to say that I'm using a dplyr technique for extracting variables that don't change over the course of the waves. There's other ways I might have done this, but since survey.w1 to 6 is a longitudinal data set, it has a row for every wave, I want to pull out some data that doesn't change over time, okay? And those things are going to be called fixed covariates because they're not time dependent. And they turn out to be the obvious candidates here: sex, race, age, region, blah, 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 all that stuff, okay? I'm going to do that by using the group by feature, okay? So I start out with this, I select the variables of interest, then I apply the group by, then I summarize the variables, and then there's a few cases, it turns out, where some of these variables turned out to have a minus infinity characteristic because particularly the max characteristic here doesn't, if you've only got one value, it won't necessarily give you what you want. And these were replaced with NAs. It's just a way of kind of dealing with that problem. And then it recodes the sex variable to a 0, 1 variable instead of 1, 2. And it does, it also recodes region to 0, 1, 2 instead of 1, 2, 3. That can be handy when you're doing dummy variable modeling. Okay. So that processing there creates a table of fixed covariates. And as we'll see up here, okay, fixed covs. So this shows a bunch of variables, and there's no wave ID field anymore. Why? Because these don't change over time. And it turns out that R-Siena needs you to tell it variables that are not longitudinal in nature, separate from those that are longitudinal in nature. And we're going to use this as a way to do that. Okay. Now we have to create a table of time varying covariates. And these, as it turns out, have to be matrices, right? Because you're going to have a value for every wave potentially. And so we're gonna format up a way of doing that. The only one of these variables that I'm using for these analyses right now is something we call the recovery factor, which I call TV.recfact to indicate that it's a time-varying covariate and consisting only of the recovery factor. And so what I do here is I start out again with good old survey.w1 to 6. I pull the survey ID, wave ID, and the recfact variable that's in that survey. I'm going to create a variable here called W, and I'm going to take that variable and pivot it into a long form table. Pivot wider is a dplyr function that basically takes long form data and it makes it into wide form data. So if I have longitudinal rows going down this way, it's going to take each one of those rows and make it into a variable instead. You know, it's a typical pivot issue with data management. I don't know. No, I don't know whether the pivot function is any easier than base R functions that do this stuff. Mike, you'd be familiar with that. It's just a way, though, of doing that. Okay.
So read your notes, John, say that you have to turn it into a ordinal variable with integer values.
That's right. And that's one of the things that we do here using the cut function, okay? So the rec factor is actually a factor score based upon some analysis that Mike did showing that we can consider recovery to be a univariate construct based upon, what was it, 10 or so indicators, Mike?
Is it 10?
Or so.
It seems
maybe
like a
8.
lot. Yeah, 7 or 8 at least.
Yeah. But, you know, it included stuff like, you know, confidence in your ability to stay sober, you know, social integration within, you know, amongst, you know, your friends and relations, financial condition, a bunch of things like that. It actually hung together pretty well as a construct. But R-Siena deals with transitions on, you know, quantitative variables as being something that occurs from one ordinal category to another, basically. There is, I should add, a feature which hasn't been fully incorporated into R-Siena yet, where you can use continuous variables. I believe that now works, but it still hasn't been included into regular R-Siena yet. But for our purposes, having like, you know, I think we used 4 categories here. Yeah, I had from, you know, below -1, -1 to 0, 0 to 1, 1 and higher were the categories that were used based upon this histogram of what the recovery factor looks like. And this is typical across, you know, all the waves. It was only for wave ID 1. But so that's why I chose to code the recovery factor with these cut points here. You know, we can talk about that, but again, that's kind of a detail. It's a little off subject here. Anyway, what that gives rise to, I'll show you what tv.recfact looks like. And it is a matrix where basically you've got subjects down here. Notice you have no subject IDs because, if I remember, R-Siena doesn't work with IDs, but there's 627 of them. And if you wanted to know what IDs were referred to what row, you could go back to that vector that Meg Netflix had created again, remember? And so you can always associate an SID with a row in all of these things if you have to. And you want to make sure that you're understanding like what data refers to what subject. That's always an important thing to do. And you'll notice that although this is a matrix, I've labeled the columns as W1 to W6. That's something you can do, even though matrices don't actually, they're not like data frames or data tables, which literally have column names which are variables.
So does R-Siena complain if you do the same for the rows but use the SID?
No, you could do that. You could label the rows if you wanted to. I haven't chosen to do that for not really any particular good or obvious reason. And it might be handy actually to, you know, have this, to add row IDs. You just have to add another line of code to this. If you want, I can do that.
Yeah, it seems like the row IDs are not a popular thing in the tidyverse.
No, but I don't think it really leads to any problems in this case. I don't think there would be any issue with that.
Yeah.
And it might be, you know, a useful thing to have for annotation purposes. You know, as opposed to just an outboard vector that would line up with the rows. Well, why not just put them in as row labels? You could do that. So good point there. Okay. In fact, I'm actually going to make a note here.
Because I've noticed that some of the tidyverse functions will actually strip out the row names. If I put them in there and give it a matrix with row names, the tidyverse says, no, you can't have those, and takes them out.
Yeah, it's got some, you know, the tidyverse definitely has its ups and downs. I think for most purposes, I find it very convenient, but every once in a while, I'll do something where you're like, what? Why do you want to do that? Okay, now, so what we now have is we have a set of sort of intermediate objects here. And those are these matrices here, you know, these sets of matrices basically, which are the longitudinal networks. We have a fixed coves object, which is like all ready to go into R-Siena. And we have this time varying covariate called recfac, TV.recfac. Now we are ready to convert these things into R-Siena specific objects, which then will go directly into R-Siena. So basically, this has all been kind of staging for giving a convenient format for actually creating the R-Siena data objects that it's going to use for the analysis. Okay, which are kind of like encapsulated versions of what we've already created. So to do that, now I've got some annotation about how this works and why you have to do it, and what they're good for, which you can read about. All right, so here's the code where we take, like, for example, a friendship network that has the structural zeros in it and the sparse conversion, okay? And I'm going to give that to a function called Siena dependent. This is a function that is in R-Siena or R-Siena test, okay? And I use that to create an object which R-Siena now can actually use as data. So I'm going to create a dependent network variable. By the way, it's useful to use the term endogenous in these models, because with certain kinds of models, you know, a dependent variable, like a plane regression analysis, you've got a dependent variable that's being predicted by a set of independent variables. But when you have a model where causation can go in both directions, you know, what's a dependent variable then? It's better to use the term endogenous variable, which is basically a variable that is predicted by other variables. It may itself also be a predictor, though, okay? So this is terminology that's used in, well, I think it kind of originated in econometrics. At least in my world it did. But the idea is that an endogenous variable can be either a predictor or a predictee, a dependent variable. And so I'll use that terminology to refer to a network, which indeed can play both roles, as we'll see. All right, so we create R-Siena dependent objects out of the FNet network, the advice net network, the loan net network, and we also create a special kind of a dependent variable out of the recovery factor variable. And look, I have to tell it, I use the same function, but in the function call, I say the type is behavior. If I don't say type is behavior, it will look at it and go, wait a second, this isn't a network. What are you talking about? But I want this to be an endogenous behavior variable, meaning that it can be used as a predictor of network functions or network relationships, but it itself is also a dependent variable. And it's being predicted by other stuff. Cool? So this is all I have to do then. This is all I've got here, in other words, for my setup for my model. I've got a set of network variables, some or all of which I could put into my analyses. And I've got one dependent behavior variable. Now here is where I create what's called a composition change object, okay? And this, I chose to call it CCSD. So, you know, composition change, Siena dependent. And there I wrote a kind of a thin encapsulation function where I go in, look at the actual network variable. In fact, I look at the SIDs, and accessing other variables that I've already created, I create this composition change object by submitting it to Siena composition change, which is another art. God, I'm really making this sound much more complicated than it is. Make CCVec creates an object that Siena composition change can read. Siena composition change is a function in R-Siena. Make CCVec is a function that I wrote to make it easier for you to create a composition change object. You don't need to worry about composition change at all. If you're going to do this stuff, you can just use this object right here, as long as you're basically using the same 627 individuals that I included in this modeling effort, and normally you will do that, okay? So for the most part, you don't need to worry about the details here. If you want to understand about composition change, how it's done, what it means, what it does, read about it in the manual, my recommendation. But you should be able to simply use this object right here every time you create an analysis, okay?
John, is the line break or the return there, is that an important part of using that pipe operator, or is that just the way you like it? Well, you've got two lines there for that one particular operation.
Yeah. Right. So what this means is, this is the equivalent of something that looks like okay.
Yeah, but would it still work if, in the way you did it with the pipe, if you put the second function that up on the first line?
Oh yeah, of course it would.
Okay.
Yeah, no, the line breaks are irrelevant. I'm sorry, I didn't understand your question. But nevertheless, it's useful to notice that this code here that uses the pipe operator is the same as this composition of functions down here. But to me, this is a little easier. You know, it's like, take this, you know, process it using Siena composition change and assign it to CCSD. It seems a little easier to me to interpret, for what it's worth. All right. Finally, I have to make suitable objects out of my other predictor variables. And there are actually other functions than this one, but I only have, the only other variables I'm going to use in this analysis are constant covariates, which is where the co-covar function comes from. Equivalently, non-time varying covariates, fixed covariates, all refers to the same thing. So I have to give, to make individual objects out of these that I'm going to put into the analysis, and I do that with this call to co-covar. Notice I just pick out the sex variable. I decide if I want it to be centered or not. Like, I don't usually center, generally speaking, most variables in R-Siena analyses are centered automatically. But when I have a binary variable, I don't want to center it, because I want to interpret the model based on, you know, the effect being a 1 value relative to a 0 value, the way you would with any dummy variable. So I set those to be uncentered. You know, sex is obviously binary, age is not, so I let it be centered. Region shouldn't be centered. The time and residence should be centered, and you know, either as the log or the straight value. So I create constant covariate objects for input to R-Siena using the co-covar function and this table fx covs that I already set up, just picking out the columns of interest. So you see why I set it up that way. It's very easy to just take that those values out of the FX coves data table and make them into individual covariates that R-Siena can use. Okay.
And these can be truly continuous. They don't have to be ordered integers.
No, once again, they need to be, yeah, actually they can be. It's only the dependent variables that can't be. Okay. And by the way, the reason for that limitation has to do with the way the vicissitudes of trying to simulate the model. You know, it turns out that simulating continuous variables can be kind of dicey. You know, there's just too many possibilities. It's much easier to deal with the probability of a transition. But one of Tom's former students has found a way to do that. Okay, so that's it for this script. Basically what this setup, R-Siena model script does is it sets up a set of objects that are going to be generally useful for a lot of different analyses. Now, clearly, I haven't included every possible analysis you could have in this script, but it gives you an idea as to how to set up other ones. If you wanted to have other fixed covariates, for example, you'd set them up this way. If you wanted to have other dependent behavior variables, you'd set them up like you did with RF. Okay, there is one class of models that you might, or variables you might also want to set up with that I haven't included here. Time varying, well, here we go. Oh yeah, time varying covariates that are, however, not endogenous. So I might want to have, I might want to use, I don't know, well, I'm blanking on a good example here from my study, but if you had a variable that you wanted to be a predictor, it does vary over time, but you don't want it to be a dependent variable in the model. You just want it to be a predictor. Then you have to use a different function, the var-covar function, to convert that into a R-Siena readable piece of data.
John, could that be like temperature outside, which does vary over time?
Sure. If you thought that had some relevance to forming friendships and stuff, who knows? Maybe it does. But yeah. Okay. So anyway, that script essentially sets up your generally applicable models. Then I have taken made the decision to use a separate script for specific analyses. And the term specific is, of course, a little bit malleable in and of itself. But the idea here is that this script will be used for a set of analyses where you're trying to answer a particularly limited set of questions and where you've made some a priori decisions as to what variables you want to use for that, which ones you want to investigate. In this case, it turns out that the script will use only one of the network variables we set up earlier, and that's going to be the friendship network. But it's also going to use all of the fixed covariates that we set up and the one endogenous behavior variable, the recovery factor. So it's made a choice as to which network I want to look at, but it has used all of the other variables that I set up in the previous script. So I talk a little bit about that. Okay, the place that you start with all of this is by creating what's called a data object for R-Siena. And that uses the function Siena data create. And look, I'm giving it all of those variables I just described. The one friendship network variable, right, FNet0SD, And then the recovery factor, the endogenous behavior variable, and then the fixed covariates, rs.sex, rs.age, rs.inres1, inres-L, excuse me, the log of the in-residence variable. And then finally, CCSD, which is the composition change object. So at a minimum, Siena data create needs a network. It needs the composition change variable, and then anything else that you want to add or not add. So essentially, these are the variables that I'm going to be able to model using this data object. Okay? So really what a data object is it's just a kind of a ball of fuzz that R-Siena that contains metadata about the predictors in the model, predictors and dependent variables that R-Siena can easily deal with. It needs to be able to do that because it would be too difficult to program input that could take any format at all, right? So this is just a particular way that Siena needs to have its data packaged to understand what it's dealing with, okay? So all of that stuff that went before that we did all came down to creating stuff that R-Siena data create could read. That's what it was for. Cool? So anyway, really, I mean, any way at all that kind of got you down to the same format, any code you wanted to write that created the same kinds of objects that could be input to Siena data create is fine. The previous script just showed you my way of doing it. All right, now the next thing you want to do is to run the print01 report function, also an R-Siena function, and that will create a file called rfnetmodels-1, you could call it anything, .text. And now you can use that, and I'll show you this here, to get some information about the data, the model that you're setting up here. So you see it says, well, you've got 6 waves, 6 observations, 627 actors. You've got 1 dependent network variable, that's the friendship one. You've got 1 dependent discrete behavior variable, that's the RF, okay? You've got 3 constant actor covariates, and then you've got 1 file with times of composition change. And these zeros represent other kinds of data you could have included, which you can read about if you want. Then it gives you the descriptive information about the data at each wave. So this is basically the, numbers 1 to 627, if you could stretch that off across your screen here far enough. And then a summary of the out degrees for each of those individuals. The in degrees, out degrees are who you choose, in degrees are who chooses you, and so forth. And then it comes down here after all this stuff and gives you some information on, okay, there's composition change. So this guy leaves the network at time 1.5. Remember how that first guy was only around for wave 1 and then he left? Typically the way you set that up is to say, okay, well, probably, since we don't know exactly when he left, we'll say he left between wave 1 and wave 2, which is wave time 1.5, okay? And that's the way that's represented in the composition change here. Same thing for actor 2, although he or she left at time 2.5, so forth. So this is all just kind of descriptive information about what the network that you've given, well, what the data that you've given to the program consists in. There's also some other interesting stuff down here, including network change, like how much change was there each wave. A particularly interesting statistic here is the Jacquard, which basically is, how much overlap is there in relationships from wave 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, et cetera. Some of these overlaps are a little bit disturbingly low, and you can run into stability problems in estimation if they're consistently below 0.2. I was worried when I saw these Jacquards in the range of 0.12 down here, but it turns out that actually the model works okay anyway. And the proof of the pudding is in the estimating. So that turned out to be okay. And then other information on, you know, discrete actor variables, so forth and so on. So there's basically descriptive information in there that you can find useful. Okay. All right. The next thing I do after setting up the data object here is I create what's called an effects object. Now the effects object is basically going to include all of the variables that could be predictors or outcomes, okay? And it is a function of the data object. So the data gets encapsulated in the data object and then gets fed to create what's called an effects object. And the effects object basically creates a big hairy table. And that table comprises every possible effect that you can include in this model. What's an effect? Well, an effect is a predictor, basically. And unlike a regression model, you can't just sort of, you know, pick any old variable and just sort of, you know, submit it as a predictor. The reasons for that are partly technical, but they have to do with the fact that the network model is specified as, well, a big difference is that unlike ordinary regression, you're not predicting a value of some dependent variable. You're predicting the formation or maintenance or cessation of a relationship. And so fundamentally, the thing that is being predicted here, at least when a network is dependent, is different than it is with a regression model. There are some analogies that work pretty well with regression in stochastic actor modeling, but that's one big difference that you have to understand. And so one of the things you need to do is to create a set of possible effects that can be included. And then a nice thing to do is to run the effects documentation function, which will now create a PDF or an HTML file containing all of those possible effects. So this here will, as I say up here, create an HTML file called fobj.html, which I will now show you. Come on. Oh, open it in the web browser. And there we go. This table is really, really important. It's fundamental to what you can now do from here on. Each one of these rows represents a parameter that can be estimated about the model. The name here refers to the predicted variable, the dependent or endogenous variable, and we only have two of those. In this particular case, it's, okay, well, this is interesting. Yeah, this is left over from when I was doing work with the loan network, not the friendship network. So in this case, you see terminology applying to the loan network. If I was showing you the one for the friendship network, it would be, and maybe I can find that right here. I don't know where it is. But it doesn't matter because it's the same basic idea. This name here will refer to the network object or objects. And there could be a whole set of these names for if I had multiple networks in this model, which you can have. And then eventually it comes down here to the dependent variable recovery factor, okay? So there are two different names referring to each dependent variable, and there can be more in general. And then a descriptive name for the effect, some information about what type it is, which is kind of comprised in the short name and type. And the object of specifying a model will be to write code and give it to R-Siena, which will pick out a set of these rows as being the effects that you want to use to do predictions. All right. So let's suppose that I wanted to see whether there's a tendency for transitive triplets to form. Okay. Well, that would be this row here. And what I will have to do is to write a little piece of code, which there's a function you can use for in R-Siena. It will pick out this effect here, and we will see then whether the lone network has a tendency to form transitive triplets. What's a transitive triplet? Well, it's a situation where if A chooses B as a lone partner and B chooses C, is there a tendency for A to choose C later on? So it's a statement about, does an existing structure potentiate the formation of additional structures down the road? And by the way, you can see how when you have effects like this, you're really thinking now in network terms. You're not thinking in terms of individual characteristics anymore, like with a regression. But the similarity is that the effect in question is supposed to be a predictor of more or fewer of these relationships over here, basically. Well, all right, we're running out of time for one thing. For another thing, we will have to have a whole separate session on talking about effects, because that's a completely different topic, all right? So for right now, I'm just gonna leave you with the fact that all of the effects that you can possibly put into a model are included in this table, and the way you specify a model is by telling R-Siena which of them you want to include, okay? And I think I'm going to use that as a stopping point for right now, because as I say, we are kind of out of time here. We only allocated 2 hours for this. And I think what I'd like to do is to start off here whenever we next decide to meet. I think we can finish the rest of this script in with less than an hour, and then we can talk about effects and model specification. How does that sound to everybody?
Hey, John, that's great. This is wonderful. Certainly, it's the cutting edge for particularly our field, community psychology with network studies. So we appreciate that. In terms of our next meeting, we could either do this at Tuesday at 11 o'clock or next Friday at 1. So you know, we could even start it on Tuesday to just continue Tuesday at 11 for those folks who can join us, and we can see how far we get, if that sounds reasonable to you, John.
Why don't we do that? And then if people can't make it, I mean, you're going to record it anyway and make it available to people.
Yeah, I'll record it. Sounds good. So,
Okay.
so John, I want to thank you. This was tremendous, wonderful overview, technical details. But I'm going to, if I figure it out right, to actually put this right into a form where people can have access to it so they can look over it again. So.
Okay, before you all go, I'm sure there must be questions. We don't really have time. We probably have time for a few questions here. But my email is jlight, J-L-I-G-H-T, @ori.org. If you have questions, email me. And I will get back to you.
That sounds good, John. That way we can let people go on. And certainly we can start out with the questions next week too.
Yeah.
So thank you again, John. Excellent overview. You really did a nice job of helping us understand this. Appreciate it.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for your attendance, and you know, questions, comments, things you'd like to see that you didn't see, whatever, let me know. You know, my goal here is to introduce this stuff as clearly as I can, and it's a lot to swallow. I understand that. So I want to make this go as smoothly as possible.
Thank you, John.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, John.
Okay, see you all later.
Thank you.
Thank you.